I'm Jason with Born Handy, and today I'm going to be changing the brakes on a 2012 Land Rover LR2. Now I can't say for certain, but I'm told by the parts supplier that this procedure should be the same for 2008 all the way through 2015 models. So if you have one of these vehicles and you need to change your brakes, stick around because I'm about to take you step by step. Let's start by breaking all the lug nuts while the vehicle is still on the ground. If you try to do this after you jack the tire up, you won't be able to break them loose. And if the lug nuts are very tight, like they are in this instance, you can step on at the lower side and pull on the upper side at the same time. And now that we've broken all the lug nuts loose, we can go ahead and jack up the tire. Now that we're off the ground, it's as simple as just loosening the rest of the lugs. Next, you're going to need to remove the caliper. You do that by removing these two 15mm bolts. Be sure you don't take these out because it's an unnecessary step. When you remove these, you can use a wrench up top, but you're going to have a socket down below. Now that both the bolts are out, you're going to want to pull the caliper off. The problem is that most likely your brake pads have worn grooves into the rotor, which will mean that the caliper won't simply come off. You'll have to take a screwdriver or some other implement and reach down in there and pry the brake pads apart so that they clear the lip created by the natural wear of the rotor. That should be more than enough, and it is. You also want to be sure that you don't let the weight of the caliper hang here and put unnecessary pressure on this brake line. You can rest it up on top just like this and it'll be fine. We're also going to be changing out the rotor, so we're going to need a large torque set. This particular one is a 45. In this case, I was able to hold the rotor and break the bit loose. At this point, the rotor should slide right off. You may have to bang on it a few times with a hammer to break it loose in the event that it's become jammed. This is a good opportunity to inspect our parking brake. In this case, we don't use them very much, so they normally last a long time. Just the way that it came off, put it back on, because we need to be sure and have good alignment for our torques to go back in place. I'm not sure what function, if any at all, this plug performed from the other rotor, but because it popped out really easily, it didn't seem to cause any harm to put it back. I'm going to put it in the new rotor. And now I want to go ahead and clamp the piston so that I can get a new brake pad in there fairly easily. The one on this side's no problem. It just simply pushes out. This side would push out too if I wanted it to, but then I may have some difficulty compressing the piston. So I tend to leave the brake pad in place while I apply pressure. And that's fully seated. Now, it's as simple as popping out the old brake pad. Now to replace these little metal clips, I'm just going to grab this and pull it forward until it removes from the caliper itself. Then these pieces just simply pop right out. And the new ones go in just the way the old ones came out. Take note of this little tab here. Make sure that this tab seats flatly on the inside of this bracket. If it doesn't, remove it and reposition it. Both sides won't clip in unless that bracket sits exactly flush against the side of the bracket. And there you have it. Both pieces are in, and now we can just reattach it just the same way that it came off. And now we're ready for our new brake pads. It may take some coaxing, but it will fit, and when it goes, it should hold itself in place well enough for you to put it back around the rotor without any problems. And now we have both sides in place, and it's as simple as putting the caliper back just the way that it came off. And now that the caliper's back on and tight, you want to be sure and pump the brakes to empty the reservoir back into the brake lines and to recompress the brake pads against the rotor. And now we're ready to put the tire back on. Well, we got interrupted by an unexpected shower. We had widely scattered showers in the forecast, but they were very widely scattered, and the chances of rain hitting in one individual area were pretty low, but looks like we got hit. So moving right along, I've got the tire back on, and I want to talk about snugging the lug nuts up before we put the tire back on the ground. You'll notice the lug nut has a tapered head on it, and that head is to center the wheel exactly around each one of these lugs. If you put this on incorrectly, you can have your wheel on in a position so that it's not fully seated against the hub. What that'll cause is when you're running down the road, the wheel can wobble, and there's potential to break one of these off or all of them off, and the potential even worse for your wheel to come off entirely while driving down the road. So be sure that you snug these up while the tire is still in the air, and it will center your wheel and seat it properly. You don't want to make them tight at this point. You just want to pull the wheel and make sure that it seats as it should. And now at this point, we can let the weight of the vehicle back down on the tire and tighten all the lugs. You also want to tighten in a general star pattern. This helps to seat the wheel evenly and reduces the risk of warpage. Once you have them pretty tight, then you can go around in pretty much any order that you want and get your final tightening. It's also a good idea, after you've driven the vehicle about 50 miles, to recheck and make sure all of your lug nuts are tight. And that completes the rear tire. I'll repeat that process on the other side. Same as before, I'll break all the lug nuts while the wheel is still on the ground. Now I'll jack up the vehicle. So when you're looking to locate the vehicle's jack points, you should be able to find these arrows near the bottom of the vehicle. These arrows correlate with a portion of the undercarriage that has been reinforced so as to be able to support the weight of the vehicle without being damaged. Now I'm able to see that the tire is clear of the ground underneath. So we're back up here, and the Torx bit, I've just did a check. For whatever reason, the 45 on the back was a little loose, but the T50 wouldn't fit it. So I suppose there was just some debris in there. The T50 does fit up here nicely, but it is worth noting that the T45 did work back there. It probably just wasn't the exact fit. In any case, I'm going to go ahead and break this loose first. We'll just set that aside for now. Now I'm going to move on over and I'm going to start breaking loose the caliper. We're going to do that by removing these two 18mm bolts. You should be able to use a wrench for both of these, or a socket if you prefer. When breaking loose these 18mm bolts, you may find it easier to go ahead and turn your steering wheel to tip these bolts outward so you can get better leverage. Boy, they sure are on there tight. Well, I wasn't able to break it with the wrench, so we're going to go with a bigger socket. And I may have to cheat. I'm certainly not telling you to cheat, but if you've been a mechanic for very long, you'll find that using cheaters on your ratchets is, unfortunately, sometimes pretty standard. Now I'll do the same thing for the bolt down below. Maybe I can break it without a cheater. Yep. This one is much easier. These pads are much more worn in the back, and that usually is the case because your front brakes do the majority of the work. But now I'm just going to go ahead and use my flat blade screwdriver to get the brake pads started moving away from the rotor so that I can get the rotor over this ridge created by just the natural wear of the brakes. And that should be enough. I'm also going to go ahead and remove this spring. I just don't want it to be a nuisance when I'm trying to remove the old pads, compress the cylinder, and put the new pads on. So I'll remove this, get it out of the way, and we'll put it back on once I've reassembled everything. And now that those are out of the way, I'm just going to lift right straight up, and I should be able to set this down right here without any issues. Now it's as simple as pulling the old rotor off and putting the new rotor on. Being mindful to line up this hole. This wasn't especially tight, so I'm not going to make a lot of effort to over tighten it. Up here on the front, there is no such metal clip like we had on the back, so I'm not going to have to worry about replacing those. You should be able to see the brake pad moving back. Now's a good time to remind that the reason we do these one at a time and pump the brakes in between each one is because if we did all four at once, we run the risk of overflowing the brake fluid reservoir and losing brake fluid. These pieces do have a retaining clip that holds them into the cylinder. So I'll just tap on the back side here and pry that right out. There we go. And now we can put this guy on. And now I'm going to place this, holding the brake pads in place, back where it should go, and put only the top bolt in place. And just do that by hand. And that's only to hold it in place while I put this spring back where we took it from originally. And it's just that simple. Now I'll tighten these back up, although probably not as tight as they originally were. I do believe that had been over tightened a bit. And don't go too tight on that top one before you've placed your bottom one in, or you might not be able to get them to line up. Now I should be able to tighten these down fully. Once I feel it begin to snug, don't torque it down yet. Go ahead and tighten up the other side. Okay, with the bottom beginning to tighten, I can move on to the top and finish tightening that one. And just as before, I'm going to go ahead and pump the brakes to reseat the brake shoes where they should be and to empty the brake fluid reservoir. And now we're ready to put our tire back on. Just the same as before, be sure to remember that the tapered end on your lug nut is designed to center your wheel along the studs so that you don't cause warping when you tighten down. So all we're going to do here is just put the lug nuts on and snug them just enough to pull the wheel into place. Alright, and there we go. I'm just going to kind of bump these tight in a star pattern. Then I'll go in more or less a circle all the way around. Keeping in mind, we're not trying to tighten here, we're just seating the wheel. And now that the wheel is on the ground, we can go ahead and fully tighten our lugs. And that's the procedure for the front. I'll go ahead and repeat that same process on the other side, and this brake job will be complete.